All right. Hello, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls. Welcome to VUX World. I was going to say, all right there. So I've kind of been slipping into, and someone pointed out that it's a Matthew McConaughey quote. And so I'll keep, for some reason, I just slip in, all right. Hello, welcome. But hello and welcome to VUX World. Today, you'll notice I am wearing my trusty Voiceflow cap because today is Voiceflow CEO Braden Ream's third appearance on VUX World. We go way back, and today is going to be an epic conversation. We're going to be discussing large language models and the future of conversation design and the future of AI application design and the future of Voiceflow. Looking forward to that coming up in just 1 minute. But before that, I need to give a shout out to our presenting sponsor today, Tidio. Tidio is a conversational AI platform that specializes in catering and providing for small to medium sized retailers. So if you have if you are a retailer, maybe you're running on something like Spotify, maybe you're running on something else, and you want to look at ways in which you can utilize artificial intelligence, then you should check out Tidio. It's got a live chat platform plus conversational AI capabilities. It's got a lot of pre-built intents, pre-built conversations around order check-in, product availability, shipping status, returns, all that kind of stuff. And it is answering somewhere, what is the figure? It's 4 out of 5 customer questions it's answering successfully. So if you want to benefit from artificial intelligence, but you don't want to put in a whole load of groundwork, time, and effort, and you want to get to market a little bit faster, then you should check out Tidio. You can, if you want to, go to tidio.com /VUX, and there you will find a promo code where you will save 20% if you were to go and join today. That is Tidio, TIDIO.com /VUX. Thank you, Tidio, for partnering and sponsoring VUX World. Now, the other thing we definitely need to discuss is, and it's coming around so thick and fast, I can't believe how fast it's coming around. It is the Voice and AI Summit in September. It's at the beginning of September from the 6th through the 8th. And it is going to be absolutely immense. We are going to be in Washington, D.C. for the Voice and AI Summit. For those of you who are familiar with the Voice Summit, you'll be familiar with the event. It's been slightly rebranded. It's now focusing more on generative AI, large language models, that kind of stuff. Last year, we had a track there. We had a stage. It was absolutely immense. We were focusing on enterprise application of AI. And today, not today, but in 2 weeks' time, we'll be doing the exact same thing. The VUX stage will be back, and we'll be looking at how large enterprises, including some large banks, including some big insurance providers, including some big healthcare companies, how are they utilizing this emerging technology in the enterprise today? And if you were to do something similar, how can you do that effectively, responsibly, and with a high degree of quality? Now, speaking, you can go to voiceand.ai, the website is, and you can get your tickets to find out more there. So speaking about utilizing large language models effectively, let's welcome on today's guest, Braden Ream. Voiceflow have just raised another round of funding, another $15 million to put into growing and scaling the platform. And so I'm delighted for Braden to join me for the third time on VUX World. Welcome.
Well, welcome myself. I'm excited to be back. Third time.
Wow. Hat trick. And now I'm wearing the Voiceflow hat, which I was lovingly given at Unparsed in July. Thank you for partnering with us for that event. It was absolutely fantastic to see you and the team over here in the UK and to support the first in-person conversation design conference in the world. It was absolutely fantastic. And now I owe you one of these for your hat trick. Your third appearance on VUX World gets you the yellow VUX cap. Very exclusive merch, this, Braden. So I'll be bringing this across the pond to Washington to present to you at the Voice and AI Summit. So there you go.
Love it. Yeah, no, it was an awesome conference. Thank you for putting on Unparsed. We're excited to be back next year.
Definitely. It was really good, actually. You know, I don't want to overly kind of plug our own events and stuff like that, but it did have a very nice communal feel about it. It was good, really great content, good vibes, good after parties, which are also very important. And looking forward to it. Can't wait to have you along next year. We have some people tuning in. We've got Paul Cutsinger. Shout out to Paul. Says, hello, party people. Jose Burgos. Howdy from Austin, Texas. Hello. Howdy from Austin. There you go. Hi from Portugal. Elson, welcome from Portugal. We are truly global, Braden, right now.
Love it. It's good to see Paul. I know Paul from way back in the Alexa days, and doing was it situational design, if you remember that?
Yeah.
Paul and I spent many hours on calls together, so it's good to see you.
Definitely. And around about that time, we were on the show. Must have been towards the back end of the Alexa sort of craze, I suppose, was the last time maybe you were on, and it was all around. We were talking about discoverability, if you remember that, the age-old conversation about getting Alexa skills discovered. It was good times back then, but it feels as though we've got another community thriving now. Like that community is blended with other communities, and now we're kind of, as a community, growing. The technology is getting better, and I don't know about you, but it feels as though we're in a similar sort of space now with large language models, generative AI, similar kind of space as we were with Alexa.
Yeah, it's funny, and every time I come on VUX World, it feels like we're sort of at another inflection moment. Alexa was really sort of the first wave of, I think, this community, that sort of came together. And really what it was the conversational AI community, but, around building agents, and Alexa happened to be the platform that we were all using. And then I think we all transitioned into sort of conversation design, more broadly, just conversational AI. We started to, pick up folks from the contact center space and other places. And then more recently, now it's all about large language models. And, that's been sort of the craze for the past 6 months. And I think what's really cool is this span and scope of large language models and the applications is tremendous. We were sort of big believers in it early on, and we've seen Voiceflow's user base essentially double to almost triple over, from the beginning of this year till now. And so that's been really exciting, introducing folks to conversation design, introducing folks to sort of the conversational AI space, with just sort of so much interest from ChatGPT pulling people in. So yeah, it's been exciting.
Nice one. We've got Lawrence again from Austin. We've got Khadija from London. Hello there. Thank you for tuning in. Feel free to stick any questions that you might have throughout this conversation in that chat, and if we can do, we will definitely try and get to it. Yeah, you're right there. I mean, there is an inflection point that seems to emerge every time we chat. I think one of them was the last time was around how, I suppose it was, as I said, towards the tail end of the Alexa sort of phase, when I think a lot of people were a little bit kind of like, they've been knocking on the door for a long time. There were certain things that still hadn't kind of materialized and stuff like that. And so it was kind of like the last few podcasts we did around Alexa specifically was very much kind of focused on that. And it's really funny because I was looking back. We've been transcribing all of our podcasts and actually using Voiceflow to mock up some examples of what the VUX bot would be like once we've accurately transcribed all the podcasts and all that kind of stuff. You're going to be able to just talk to the podcast basically and have a conversation with all the guests that were on it and mine all the information that's been in there, which is going to be great. Cool. But I was going back through the episode that I did with Georgia Quinter. And it was it must have been 2018. And he's talking about three things that were an issue, which was, one is discoverability, the other was retention, and the other was monetization. Mm-hmm. And it just had me thinking, preparing for this conversation and thinking about this conversation. It's like we had that exact conversation probably 2 years after I had the conversation with Joe, and those challenges were still there. Whereas now, I don't think it seems as though, I mean, obviously we can get into some of this stuff around like, the perception of hallucinations and potentially the perception of a slight lack of control, perhaps, if you're using large language models, but at least it feels positive. It feels as though the challenges that may exist are kind of surmountable as you start to mix and blend different technologies together. So it feels like a really positive time to be in this space, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think it was interesting. Like when we were an Alexa skills focused company, I had a conversation with an investor actually who goes, you as a tool maker can only make money if your customers are making money. And that was a really profound thought. Like you might have, product market fit, you might be the world's best Alexa skill building tool, but unless your customers are making money and they're, if let's say that's an agency, so, it's, Voiceflow sells, tools to people who are building agents. If those agents then are providing value to their end customers, the value has to flow up, right? If the value doesn't flow up, if, Alexa skills can't be monetized well, then the Alexa skill builders aren't making enough money, which then makes the tool builders not be able to have enough money, and then it sort of all just flows up the chain. And I think what's really been exciting about large language models is we are seeing a ton of people make money now, whether they're just automating far more conversations than they could before. They're able to hit higher deflection rates. They're able to provide better CSAT scores, or even what we're starting to see too is the emergence of like a really strong agency layer servicing SMBs and mid markets, where normally to stand up like an enterprise chatbot, it's really expensive, right? You need a ton of people, full-time staff, all this kind of stuff. But with large language models, it's brought the floor down of cost creation, or like the cost floor down so low that now these like 1, 2, 3-person agencies are able to service really large companies with really sophisticated bots that just wasn't possible before. And so the value is now flowing up, which has been really exciting to see. And it's a big change, I think, for this community to now have use cases that are like, there's no more opportunity ahead of us than there is behind us at this point, which I think maybe wasn't the case with previous channels.
And so congratulations on your latest round of funding. That's great news. Very much a vote of confidence in terms of what you're doing there. You've done a lot, not just since we last spoke, but in the last 8 months, to be honest, in terms of iterating the product. Every single second day there's a video on LinkedIn with a new feature and stuff like that. So you've really sort of like grabbed the bull by its horns. Describe to us a little bit about what that journey has been like and how you're thinking about large language models as part of the, not necessarily the Voiceflow product, but as part of the tool set for developing and creating these experiences.
Yeah, so when ChatGPT first launched, like a lot of folks on this sort of call, we were A, blown away, and B, didn't know exactly how this was going to play into our business. And the approach we decided to take was, let's innovate really, really quickly, and basically let's learn with our customers. And so what we did is we actually segmented Voiceflow's product into 2 products. So what we used to have was just Voiceflow, which is a conversation design platform, and it would sit on top of traditional NLU providers, right? So like Dialogflow, IBM Watson, Raza, all these kinds of things. And what we did is we partitioned the product and we said, this is going to be the AI playground, essentially like the AI builder. And this is going to be our traditional NLU product. And what that allowed us to do was to really quickly start to innovate and just throw stuff at the wall on the AI builder. And we had, a legal disclaimer, and it's still there when you start using Voiceflow's AI builder. Hey, just want to let you know, large language models, if you're going to push it to production, know that they can hallucinate. If you're going to be playing with different models, there's experimental features in here, all this kind of stuff. And we basically gave ourselves the liberty to try to iterate as fast as possible because we didn't know what was going to work. So we basically mapped out all of the possible use cases that we could initially think of. And what's crazy is like, we would not even be thinking about like, transcript management and different examples of prompt chaining and, responding from memory, saving, LLM responses into variables, like all these kinds of things that we've launched in the past couple of months. We wouldn't have been able to predict them 6 or 8 months ago. But what happened is that we were launching features, customers would come and say, hey, what about this? Could I do this now? Could I do this? And only as we launched more features did we understand more about large language models and how they play into conversational AI, which then led the roadmap for the next set of features. And so we've just been trying to take this iterative approach of let's innovate with our customers. Let's try to launch weekly. And that's been really successful. Like we've seen a ton of usage and people have really been loving the new features. We're actually very close to the point of where generative AI features are now about to surpass the original business. It's like, every single week it now teeters, they're like neck and neck. And so that's been really exciting to see.
Interesting. And so in terms of the genesis of Voiceflow, you began as essentially a interactive story building platform for Amazon Alexa. And then, quickly realized that you have something here that can be used and applied elsewhere, such as, broadly speaking, conversational AI. And then it became more of a design platform where a lot of sort of teams were using it to collaborate on designs and, using it to prototype and test early kind of iterations and stuff like that. And although there was always a feature there which let you to publish a chatbot, for example, on a front end, it always struck me as though the value and positioning of the value from Voiceflow's perspective was all around teamwork, design, concepting, prototyping, getting your ideas out there so that when you come to commit to building something in Watson or Dialogflow or wherever,
Yeah.
you've worked out the kinks, you've got everything sort of, you've got your ducks in a row, and there's no surprises, kind of thing.
Yeah.
Whereas now there's a lot more features regarding LLMs, and a lot of the tooling and stuff that you've like harnessed around it. It's not necessarily, it seems to me at least, applicable, or the same use cases don't necessarily apply where you would do all of this work to craft this experience using LLMs and then just take that and go and build it somewhere else. And
Yeah.
so, and we've had some conversations about this in the past, and I was excited to see in the press release that it's explicitly stated there that Voiceflow now sees itself as being a production-ready enterprise platform
Yeah.
rather than a design tool. So I'm wondering if you can talk us through that kind of transition.
Yeah. So the reason that we chose collaboration as sort of the focal point is we really wanted to serve enterprise product teams, and in specific that relationship between conversation designers and their developer counterparts. We really wanted to be sort of the genesis between the two of them, and we felt that we weren't ready to take on larger platforms like a Dialogflow or IBM Watson. We were too small a company, and when we looked at our resources, it was, let's be really amazing at one thing. Let's be incredible at conversation design. Let's really nail collaboration. And so we spent like 2.5 years basically perfecting the conversation design workflow. How do you design, prototype, collaborate, and essentially thinking about conversational AI, not just from the outcome, but from actually the optimizing the inputs of the workflow. Basically saying, hey, and a lot of platforms, they focus on like, what is the art of the possible if you use every single nook and cranny in the what's that final widget look like, but then they don't really think about much about the actual creation experience themselves, which makes it then hard to achieve that outcome, right? If you're super outcome oriented and you don't think at all about the inputs and like how people actually get there, sometimes it can be it's like if you have the I don't know, the ability to have the fastest car in the world, but it requires so much gas it can only run for a minute or something like that, right? Like it's actually like, yes, you can achieve that incredible outcome, but the inputs matter a lot. And so we focused a lot on inputs for 2 years, and that led us to get to 130,000 global users. We were able to get to a pretty large chunk of the Fortune 500 now in terms of just sort of customers, and we've been super blessed to have the incredible customers that we do. And now with this latest funding round, we actually had the majority of our previous funding rounds still in the bank. And so we're sitting on a lot of cash right now. And we're trying to think about how do we actually now do what our customers have been asking for, which is 2 years, which is, hey, everyone's been pointing it out. They say, Voiceflow has this incredible conversation design tool you guys have built over like the past like 40 years, basically. You guys also have a really strong NLU. You also have an NLU manager and analytics and transcripts. Like, what am I not getting, right? You sort of have all the end-to-end components. And now we feel like we're in a position where we can start to say, hey, you know what? As you do evaluate vendors, you can use Voiceflow for just conversation design, use this in our traditional business, but now also you can take us end-to-end. So we're having some of those conversations with customers, and that's been a really exciting sort of transition where we feel like we're able to. And also, I think a lot for startups, if you're in a really big market like conversational AI, you got to be amazing at like, at least one thing where you're known for. Because I think you have a lot of like jack of all trades, master of none vendors. And that's a really tough spot to be in when you're in such a competitive space. Like you go to these conferences like Voice and AI in September, there's, my plug for Pete. There's a ton of vendors where it's like kind of all the same stuff, right? Same catchphrases, same, metric that they're scoring on. And so we want to be, world-class at one thing, and then slowly over time be world-class at sort of the whole stack, but make sure that we don't lose that initial edge. So yeah, people have been predicting it for a long time, including yourself. And, we're now sort of coming out of the shell a little bit. And with this latest funding round, try to, really signal strength that, hey, we're going to take this pretty seriously and become the world's best conversational AI platform with a focus on collaboration, being tech agnostic, and then having that design centricity, that sort of collaboration between designers and developers. Those are really the three things that we're focusing the platform on.
Yeah, and it makes sense. I mean, I remember the discussions that we've had in the past, which is that Whether other platforms are kind of jack of all trades or what have you isn't necessarily for me to say, but I think that definitely the difference that I can see is that most platforms are very much technical platforms. Like even though like not like generally speaking, I can open up Dialogflow CX. I know my way around it. I can build something.
Yeah.
Same with IBM Watson. Same with Dialogflow ES. Really, you can kind of get away with it, but the problem is that really to build a real robust conversation in there, like you should see some of the stuff that Justin's been building in Dialogflow CX. Our CTO Justin. It's like it becomes very complicated very quickly when you have a technical brain that builds out production grade software. And so those tools always for me have at least have seemed to be technical first tooling, whereas Voiceflow has always been design led.
Yeah.
So I suppose, and I don't know whether or not I'm asking you to give away any of the secrets here, but like if you look at the platforms like that, like Dialogflow and IBM Watson, like Brett
Yeah.
presented some really great information that we commissioned him for ahead of Unpars, which was when he asked like what design tools or what frameworks do people have experience with, and it was like neck and neck between Dialogflow and Voiceflow, and all other vendors were sort of down there, which almost to me kind of speaks to the split of skill sets in the industry. You've got loads of designers, loads of developers, but there doesn't seem to be that kind of middle ground. And this isn't necessarily a criticism of Voiceflow, but one of the things that was always a bit of a challenge was that how do you get all of that robust, complex design from Voiceflow into Watson or something like that? I know there's export tools and stuff like that, but it's like there never seems to be this kind of middle ground between development and design. Whereas that seems to me to be where Voiceflow potentially can play is to go from having the easy to use, design friendly, agnostic kind of tooling, and then moving more into the technical space. So I wonder whether like I had two questions about that. One is like who do you see your customer being now or becoming? And two, in terms of the sort of like platform itself, where do you see that Voiceflow needs to improve if it is going to become as enterprise ready as a Dialogflow or IBM Watson? So maybe we'll do the second question first, and then we'll go to the target audience one after that.
Yeah, it's a great question. So, I think the way to think about this is you have developers, if they generally know how to code, right? I don't want to be, give too broad sweeping of a statement, but generally speaking, developers can code. And so when we think about like the tools that a developer wants to use, it's often not using a GUI. And so the GUI is there to make some functions of like the development process easier, but the actual development is going to be done with code. And so I think what you've had the developer platforms like a Dialogflow basically say, oh, we'll do the low code thing, and they start from the developer, and then they start to add on, sort of their GUI interface, but it's essentially a GUI for a development tool. The way that we're thinking about this is let's actually segment the developer platform, which is all of our API documentation, right? Have a service-oriented approach where we are exposing as much of Voiceflow's platform as we can through great SDKs, APIs, really good developer documentation. So you can build custom tools and workflow on top of Voiceflow, and you never have to go into the GUI. And then for the designers, let's have an incredible GUI. And so I think the approach of Dialogflow and Watson and a lot of these sort of like large developer platforms has been to couple them, which I think can then, when you're a developer, you can kind of do anything. That's like the most amazing part about being a developer. The challenge is a GUI cannot have everything in it. GUIs are opinionated, and being a developer is actually allows you to sort of have this unlimited amount of workflow. And so those two things, if you try to combine them, you end up having a GUI that has a million buttons and a million switches and toggles and this and that, because you're trying to put all the power of code into something that is ultimately a constrained interface. And so, yeah, the approach that we're taking at Voiceflow is the GUI, which like essentially the design tool, remains extremely opinionated. In fact, we're making a lot of like big changes behind the scenes right now to make the GUI that people love and use even better. Like, how do we continue to double down and reinvest in that system? Because people are like, oh, we love Voiceflow, and we sit there and we see all the flaws. We're like, oh, this could be better. This could be smoother. That's gonna we're gonna continue to invest really heavily there. But for the developer platform, we don't think we have to add complexity to the GUI. We think what we can do is start to showcase all the underlying APIs, and we're starting to see this. So last week, for example, we just launched a brand new API, which is the knowledge base management API. What this allows you to do is to upload, replace, manage all of your knowledge base programmatically through an API. Why that's really valuable is the developer doesn't even have to go into Voiceflow. You can actually even create your own GUI layer, your own internal tooling, and you're managing your Voiceflow assistant programmatically. And so by bifurcating the platform into these two different areas, you're allowing the developers to do what they do best, which is use the tools we've given them, but then build their own tooling, their own layers, their own workflows around it, and then give the designers something that is meant for them. And so we think that's the correct approach. And ultimately, we think that that's what's going to allow for that simplicity that people love from Voiceflow, but also paired with the scalability. Since I think, if you're trying to do it all, you end up kind of being like nothing for no one. And I think that's where a lot of the platforms like Dialogflow CX have kind of gotten themselves stuck. And then they've tried to make a developer tool into a design tool, and you end up, being a developer platform, which, requires you to use the GUI in some places and isn't very flexible. And you have designers being like, what the heck is this? There's just way too many developer, toggles, switches, widgets and stuff all over the place. So to your second question, that's it. On the first question, in terms of where do we focus now? Who's our customer? Voiceflow for the past 2.5 years has been conversation design teams. That's our customer. Like the actual end user is the conversation designer, and then ultimately, like the customer is the team itself, right? So we're thinking about workflow and all that kind of stuff. We're still selling the same folks. The difference is we're going one layer up, and that it's not just conversation designers and their teams, because that's one part of the broader conversational AI team. Now we're thinking about product owners, the actual developers, the data scientists. How do we give them all a place in Voiceflow where they actually have a seat at the table? It's a one collaborative interface. And again, when we think about collaboration, like every single role has its own, unique way to work. Because we say we're going to target developers doesn't mean we're expecting them to go into the GUI. How do we give them the tools to interact with Voiceflow without even having to go into the GUI? How do we give the designer their tools? How do we give the product owner a management dashboard so they don't have to, how do we give each owner of each different part of the workflow their own place in Voiceflow? And ultimately, we think that will become sort of like the ultimate collaboration platform that can span from design to development and all that good stuff. So bit of a rant, bit of a tangent, but hopefully that helped sort of give everyone the picture of how we're thinking about the platform, which is ultimately build the interface that works best for the end user. If it's a developer, we're going to give them great APIs. If it's the designer, we're going to give you the world's best conversation design interface. Both of them work together seamlessly, but ultimately you have your own place.
You mentioned though that you have seen the usage double over, or it might have been double or triple since the launch of ChatGPT. So you've got a lot of customers who are like enterprise conversation design teams, but that I imagine, correct me if I'm wrong, but I imagine that a lot of the increase in usership over the last kind of 8 to 10 months has been from people who are keen to explore large language models. They probably have either experimented with LangChain or AutoGPT or these kind of tools, and all of a sudden now there's a system that does kind of a similar thing but requires a bit less coding. But the community, I suppose, that's building up around large language models is more of a technical community, rightly or wrongly. It's the people building the open source tools. They're the ones kind of like building all of this kind of ancillary MLOps kind of tooling. Would you say that that's the people who've been joining Voiceflow recently, like not from the enterprise side, but more from like the hobbyists that want to just get in there and test it out as a tool? Like, because I would assume that you've probably had more development or technical people using the platform over the last few months.
Way more, right? And I think, you've guessed correctly that a lot of the growth that we've seen has been that sort of technical audience. And that's been pushing us further in sort of this direction of, hey, how do we maintain the best conversation design experience, but also service these other folks who want to customize, they want to tweak, they want to use, custom interfaces and things. And we've really been trying to be the bridge between these two communities. And ultimately, we think what's going to be the most powerful thing is how can Voiceflow enable these incredible developers who are building, I saw we have a big Discord community that's blown up over the past couple of weeks. And I saw this one developer who created two things. They created a custom web chat widget where they're like, I want it to be waving to the customer in the bottom right. And I want it to, have all this cool, Calendly functionality where you basically book meetings through the widget. And they just built that themselves using our open source. And then now they're able to share that with designers. And I thought that was really cool. Like, how do we enable the developers to actually build and give value? So, that's what being a true platform is. And we're trying to sort of push in that direction. How do we allow customers to actually provide value for each other as well? Right. So, we've seen this over the past couple of years. People who know Voiceflow, it's become a bit of an employable skill. You see it in job descriptions and stuff. That's great. That's, value between the designers. Now, how do we allow the developers to give value to the designers and vice versa, right? How do we allow them to have a single platform where they can work together, create things, and ultimately share? And so I think that's been really exciting. And we're going to see how that continues to sort of emerge. And, we've got some fun features coming up, which we think are going to even supercharge this further for the community. But ultimately, yeah, it's that mixing of design development, which was where we actually think like sort of the sweet spot and like where the magic happens is, because Voiceflow has largely been designed for the past like 2.5 years. So to see this influx of developers who are able to extend Voiceflow even further is awesome. Here's by the way, this is my favorite example. We had a developer who they saw our knowledge base and they go, it's actually we don't like the interface that Voiceflow provides. And so they took our API and they built their entirely own custom knowledge base interface on top of Voiceflow that they've now been giving to their clients, which we thought was awesome, right? And it's funny at first, like I was like, hold up, I'm offended you don't like our knowledge base interface. But then the best part about being a platform is, if you don't like how Voiceflow presents the information, or if you want to tweak it a little bit, you want to add a block that we're missing, you want to change the prototyping experience, change how the chat interface looks, like we should give you the ability to do that. Because we will never be perfect for every team, but if you have the ability to develop, we can now be perfect for every team, right? And hopefully customers start to help work with each other and fix those gaps and things. And so we're super excited to see that sort of like the emerging platform ecosystem, which is going to be really cool.
Definitely. I remember listening to a podcast a long time ago with Ben Thompson from Stratechery, and he defined platform as a suite of capabilities upon which further value can be added. So Windows as an operating system is a platform, because on top of that, you can build an application yourself that then adds further value to the whole platform. Now we've got Word. So now everyone can use Word. It adds further value to the whole thing. So that's kind of, and when a lot of the time when, when people say that they have a platform, most of the time it is kind of an out of the box suite of tools. And yes, you can assemble them to add value, but when it comes to extending it for a very particular case that you need to extend it for, like that knowledge base example that you give, that's when you find actually a lot of the platforms are closed, and you can only do what you can do within the confines of the environment you're given. So I definitely like that approach. I'm curious about, we've got a question here from Olya, which I'll come to in a minute, because we kind of touched on sort of like multimodal, that widget you mentioned, the Calendly widget and stuff like that. But I'm curious about sort of like thinking about the future. There's two paths I can see, but maybe you can go down both paths. One is continuation of providing tooling for the enterprise, which is for conversation design teams and development teams, trying to bridge that gap, trying to kind of like have them enhance use large language models responsibly and stuff like that. But then at the same time, you've got a lot of hobbyists, and these are the people who are building your likes of the lang chains, and they're building applications with that. And so potentially the other side of this, which whether it's more scalable or not, you tell me, is that Voiceflow being used potentially as the underlying platform that sits underneath future businesses that are kind of like AI first businesses. And so I don't know if you've given any consideration to, because it seems as though those influx of new users who are the developers, they're not necessarily working at an enterprise trying to build applications for those. They're probably trying to figure out, okay, how do I build something that's going to let me build a business around or something like that? Would you say that's kind of, am I on the right lines?
No, I totally. And like, so I'll touch on like the general sort of framework we're thinking about this, and then I'll go specifically into multimodal. On the general framework, I think there's sort of three types of like software companies. Essentially, there's tools, and this is like sort of in the B2B space. There's tools, there's Voiceflow, and we build a tool which provides value to solve a particular business problem. And we give you value, and we hope that you pay us money, and that's sort of that's the business. And then there's a platform, and a platform is which we give you, as you mentioned, a set of capabilities of which you can extend further. So a tool is going to be just sort of You have an accounting problem or accounting software. Now we're saying, hey, here's a bunch of building blocks of which to build even further value upon, right? So that's like sort of what a platform is. I think the final step is when there's an ecosystem, and that's when it is, the platform, and then you have users who are able to, without knowledge of the platform or without even needing the platform, they're providing value to each other. And so a good example of that is going to be like, let's say, Shopify consultants for building out, different Shopify sites, different Shopify templates. You can see Salesforce. There's a whole ecosystem built around, the implementation and consulting for Salesforce. And I think, as we think about AI agents, the reason that we haven't closed Voiceflow down, we have a ton of users who are just on the free plan is because we really want to build that ecosystem. How do we allow for users to build on top of Voiceflow, build businesses on top of Voiceflow, where folks are building consultancies, they're able to build implementation services, training services. I've told folks before, the folks at CDI who are awesome, we don't want to be the company that's, doing everything for every customer. We'd much rather have value circulating around, right? We just want to focus on how do we build the best possible platform, and then how do we enable the community to provide value to each other and, sort of build on top. So that's where we're going to just continue to extend or open more and more APIs so that Voiceflow, let's say there's Voiceflow has a conversation design platform, a knowledge base, an NLU, and it has like a dialogue manager, right? We have more than that, but there's just 4, platform components. Let's say customer likes A, B, and D, but they don't like C, right? Let's say they really prefer Dialogflow's NLU. We want that customer to be able to say, okay, I can still use Voiceflow. I'm going to build with A, B, C, and D, but C is going to be a different vendor. Like, how do we allow people to swap to build out their ideal workflow and technology stack? We think that's what's like sort of the most exciting opportunity, is to be able to sort of build that like ecosystem where people are helping each other do that, and a platform that allows for that to be possible. And then last on multimodal. So what you're going to see is we're trying to lead with, how do we allow everything to be possible in Voiceflow first? And so this has been our approach for years now. How do we allow for almost like a hacky solution to get done? So when you see like me posting LinkedIn videos and things, it's often what is like the MVP approach, where it's possible now. You can do it. It might not be well productized though. It might not have a great GUI experience. It might not have a good UX. And like over time, as things become more and more core to Voiceflow and like to all users, we'll make that increasingly core. So a good example of multimodal is we actually have a couple of customers who are using a POC that we built, which was touch hotspots. So the ability to have like a phone with a prototype that's actually going to go ahead and like, you can use touch, you can use voice. It's like this fully sort of multimodal touch prototype. And if enough customers get value from that, then we start to think about, well, how do we really productize this? How do we make it a really seamless UX inside Voiceflow instead of something that you're just building on top of the platform? And so I think, Olya, to your question on multimodal, a lot of the stuff is possible in Voiceflow today, but it requires some of the developer sides of the platform. And over time, as we see more demand and people are starting to like use some of these platform features, we'll look to actually sort of verticalize it inside of Voiceflow and make it a core part of the experience. But today, we're actually just laser focused specifically on web chat, the dialogue API, and the actual just platform itself. Those are the areas we're really, really focused on. Because if we try to do everything all at once, we're going to kind of give you guys like the lukewarm, platform experience where it kind of, it's a jack of all trades, master of none. We want to give you guys like the best collaborative conversational AI platform. It's by far the best. And then over time, expose more and more APIs so that you guys can build what you need first. And then over time, hopefully Voiceflow becomes a bigger company, we're going to be able to go ahead and extend. So yeah, hopefully that was a helpful framework to think about how we make decisions.
Yeah, absolutely. We've got a question here, and I apologies because I can't see. It just comes through as LinkedIn user for some reason. Maybe it's because we're not connected or whatever. But it's someone who's saying, are we interested in platforms or frameworks? I think we get power from frameworks. So what, in your kind of opinion, is the difference between a platform and a framework?
Yeah, great. This is great. So in my opinion, the platform is the ability to do something, and the framework is the best way to do it that's layered on top. And so What we're trying to do is build a technology platform that makes kind of anything possible, and then we're layering on our opinions. So what's a good example of that? In Voiceflow, you have domains, topics. So essentially, like, what's the information architecture of the agent itself, right? How is it structured? The platform doesn't really care per se. Like, it's all it's you can build transformers to turn Voiceflow's JSON into another structure. You can turn Voiceflow's JSON structure into a Dialogflow structure. Like, you can sort of convert it all over the place. But we started with an opinion, and that opinion is sort of the Voiceflow framework, of which like all of our standards are built on top of. So for us, it's called the .vf file, which is the .voiceflow. That then leads into the GUI itself, is all structured in that same sort of thinking, which is domains are like the collection of it's the broadest possible grouping of functionality. It's like everything to do with refunds, and then you go into topics where it's like, what are the specific types of things that we're doing within refunds, and then you go into flows, which are like the very specific like multi-step interactions in order to complete that. That's our general Voiceflow framework, but it all sits on top of a technology platform that is much less opinionated and more malleable. So if you want to change that, at least you know what our opinion is first, and that's what allows you to convert our opinion into another opinion, because you need to know how Voiceflow thinks about data. It can't just be this amorphous blob. Yeah, hopefully that's helpful. We have a technology platform, and our framework of how we think about the world is layered on top. But because it's a platform, it's flexible for you to ultimately work with it. And we document our opinion.
Nice, perfect. So at Unpars, what was really interesting is that we had a lot of great content from a lot of seasoned conversation designers who were all presenting. Every second talk, I would say, had some feature of large language model or generative AI in there, something like that, which is really great to see. So you've got the conversation design community, seemingly, if you were to go on the face of the content out on Past, really embracing large language models. At the same time, though, there seems to be, and I don't know whether this died down now or not, but there is definitely this kind of, I suppose, period of uncertainty where some conversation designers are thinking like, well, what's my job going to be now, and then you have kind of like, and I've always believed that language understanding is first and foremost a technical problem, but creating experiences is first and foremost a design problem. So you have to have both of them working together. And if everything's very much heavily design focused and there's no technical ability, you're going to end up with something with no substance that can't deliver on what it promises. If something's really technical first with no design thinking, it ends up being really clunky and the experience is terrible. A really good example of that is I won't call out the specific train line, but there was Alexa skill, and it was a train booking skill. And as we were starting to learn conversation design during the course of building Alexa skills, you mentioned earlier on situational design. Situational design being the ability to design for a given state of a conversation and having the flexibility to, when someone wants to change the state of that conversation, being able to go with the flow and do that. So if you're in the middle of booking and checking train times for a train, and all of a sudden you want to do something else, like ask a question about whether you've got disabled facilities or whatever, then you can do that without affecting the state of the flow that you're in. Yep. Whereas, but those experiences that were done, which was more of a technically led experience in this train booking example, you chose at the beginning. You can either check train times or you can book a train. If you go down checking train times, now all of a sudden you're in this path. You're down this kind of like tree, for want of a better phrase, and you get to the point where you found out your train time. If you said, okay, I want to book that, it would never let you do it because you weren't in the right tree. You weren't in the right branch for that. You had to go back to the beginning, go on book, and then go through select your times again, and then you get to you. So that was, for me, that was an example of a solution that was built, which was technical first. How can we do this? Well, we need train times, we need bookings, but the experience was terrible. And so it feels to me as though we're going through this period with generative AI where really, to use generative AI, aside from what Voiceflow have built, and some other tools which have started to democratize access to that, predominantly these are just APIs. So you need to have technical prowess to be able to use them in the first place. And so people are building tools like LangChain and AutoGPT, all this kind of stuff, and they're all very technically minded folks. And so I think what some designers have felt like is that, well, large language models have got tremendous power because they can produce dialogue, which is part of my job. They can understand dialogue, which is another part of my job. And it seems as though the only people who are building this stuff is all technical people. So is this now becoming more of a technical job rather than a design job? And so I wanted to ask this on behalf of those conversation designers that might be feeling this. My opinions, these are not my opinions, but this is just, I think it's good to get the question out there, which is, for the conversation designers thinking that actually large language models are a very technical thing, it doesn't really concern me too much. What am I going to be doing? And that is my kind of role in jeopardy, so to speak. I wonder what your thoughts are on that and how large language models are affecting or impacting the role of a conversation designer or conversation developer.
Yeah. So my opinion on this is jobs need to be focused on outputs, not inputs. And conversation design, if we think about the actual tools and the responsibilities today, and if we define the job as that, then yeah, the job's gonna go away per se, right? But if we think about the job of the conversation designer as to create great user experiences for automated agents, that are sort of working through a conversational interface, then like that job's only going to get bigger, because like the amount of agents out there is just going to get dramatically larger. And so I think about, like, let's look at visual design as a parallel. The job of a visual designer, actually, a programmer is even better. Let's actually look at a programmer. A programmer 20 years ago, being a developer per se, would have been a bit of a different experience, completely different frameworks, right? You have to think a lot more about the actual how you're working with hardware, server setups, all this kind of stuff. Like, this is before AWS. Like, development looked very different. But now, as the tools have changed, right? Now you have serverless compute, you've got AWS, you've got languages which are much less brittle, because memories become less of a thing that you need to worry as much about. Being a developer has changed a lot, right? And so when I think about conversation design, if we think about the tools and the skills that we use every single day, it's for sure, it's going to feel like a scary time. It's going to feel like the job is changing. But again, if we zoom out and we think about the output, if you're a developer, your job is to create great great programs that ultimately achieve a business outcome. And if you're a designer, your job is to create great user experiences that ultimately achieve a business outcome. Then it's a really exciting time. And it's sort of the last anecdotal change is when, what large language models do is they decouple the interface from the business logic. And so I think in the past, when we thought about conversational AI, the actual ability to speak was so tightly coupled with the business logic. And so what this would be akin to is, imagine you're Starbucks and you're hiring a barista, and you go up to that person and say, hey, you've got to teach them how to speak English, and you have to teach them how to be a barista. That was essentially what we were doing the past 5 years. The great thing is now with large language models, it's like hiring someone off the street. You only have to teach them how to work at Starbucks. What are the procedures? How do you talk with customers? What tone do you use? Someone asks for a refund. How do you do that, right? You don't have to worry about them knowing how to speak a language and be able to actually chat with folks. And so that's what large language models have effectively done. My Siri's going off. That will never not be funny in our industry, is when your voice assistant starts going off. But it's decoupled the interface from the business logic. And so I think conversation design is going to move essentially up a level, right? In the same way that when developers didn't have to worry about setting up servers in their basement anymore, and they were able to essentially move up a level, when JavaScript and languages that have better memory management came out, you were able to sort of move up a level. Now conversation design is going to be able to move up a level in the stack. You're not just worrying about the specific copy. You're thinking a lot more about the experience holistically, the persona, and when the cost of I forget the exact stats, but it was when the cost of airfare went down dramatically, it's not like airlines would have at a business, they just flew to more places. And so I think as the cost of agent creation comes down, it's not that there's going to be less jobs for people building agents. There's just going to be way more jobs because there's way more agents, right? There's way more UX, sort of holistic experiences to think about. So I think for the conversational designers out there, it's ultimately up to you in how you approach sort of the changing landscape. And I think the best way to approach it is to think about the end experience. And if the tools that are required to build that end experience are changing, UI design's gone from like, Photoshop to, I mean, even I'm sure there was software even before that. It's, gone from like, Photoshop to, to Sketch to Figma. You should be thinking about the tools that you're using as well, because ultimately it's about achieving that great outcome.
Nice. And so you alluded to something there, which is interesting in terms of one of the concerns that businesses have around large language models is the whole hallucination problem. And I know a lot of big enterprises who are experimenting with this kind of stuff internally for internal, knowledge search and stuff like that. And I've seen a couple of examples like loop insurance and stuff like that, where they're using it on the front end and on that lot. And in that instance, actually, it worked pretty well. But there's definitely kind of, for certain types of companies, a bit of apprehension. And I suppose some of that is because for me, there's different levels of use cases. We've got this like DITAT framework, which is like that goes from deflecting use cases, which I view as the FAQ stuff, which is a nice playground right now for large language models answering questions. It then goes to interpreting use cases, where you need to basically, it's like a one-way data retrieval from a line of business system. And then it starts to become a little bit more deterministic, because you need to get information from someone to validate it, to then retrieve the right kind of data. Then it moves to transacting, which is two-way integration. So then it becomes even more deterministic, because you need to get the right data in and to get the right data out. So then you need to start following a defined business process. Then it moves on to assisting and transforming, and the assisting and transforming is about being more proactive, using data in a more sensible way, better natural language understanding, which I think LLMs can definitely help with. And then transforming is use cases that you couldn't have imagined or delivered previously with humans alone. And so in the transacting bit, the T, this is where businesses are beginning to get to. They've always focused on the content, the search, and large language models are proving that, minus the odd hallucination, that they can do something in that space. When it comes to the next stage of maturity, you start to then you'd need to get a bit more deterministic, because business processes and policies at different companies are different. So I'm curious about your thoughts on, because you mentioned there around, the conversation design being less about being deterministic, less about what do I say here and do this for that flow, and more about abstracting that. Yet a large language model isn't necessarily familiar with XYZ bank's specific policy. So I'm just curious about how you're thinking about moving from the sort of like the deflecting based use cases, the FAQs and the question answer, the knowledge based stuff, more towards more kind of like utility based, mission critical, transactional kind of use cases, and the role large language models can play there, or the challenges of doing that.
I think generally there's sort of two levels of assistant complexity. I would actually, I'd argue there's three. So one is like, it's just FAQ automation, right? It's essentially knowledge automation, single turn conversations, right? Then you move into like what I almost describe as like routing conversations, where the goal is not to do end-to-end automation. It's to get the person to the right queue for the live handoff with all the right information, right? So and these sort of build up. And then the last is that end-to-end automation, right? And so there's sort of these three different levels of agent. I think, touching on sort of the LLMs and this stuff, business logic, in my opinion, should still be fairly deterministic, because like logic is like what the reason LLMs hallucinate is ultimately what these models are doing is predicting what to say next based off what was said previously, and it doesn't necessarily have an innate understanding of your business per se. You kind of have to code that in. It's the same thing with Starbucks. Like, if I was to hire a barista and say, hey, take this order, there needs to be an innate understanding that in order to take the order, I need their name, what they want, and how they're going to pay. These are like the non-negotiables of my business, right? Like you can, I almost think about it like there's this like rigid core of business logic. And instead of the logic being rigid and the conversation used to be rigid, you now have this incredibly fluid interface on top, which is awesome, but it's sort of gliding over top of a rigid interface of logic. And I think for most businesses that like that's not going to change, right? I don't think Starbucks is going to say, hey, just because we have a large language model now, it means, they don't have to tell us how they're going to pay. That still has to be there. And ultimately too, there's a level, there's human accountability. At what point, who's accountable for the bot? And that's where I think that rigid communication comes in. So I think what you'll probably see is something like this, sort of using these two different ideas. You'll see a lot of FAQs using generative AI. You'll see like large language models paired with knowledge bases. I think like that level 1 of agent, it's such a good use case because it handles the long tail really well. It's able to synthesize information from different data sources. That's great. I think when you then go up to the agent assist, I think you'll then have like exit criteria essentially of like, you'll try to have end-to-end automation, of course, but you're not always going to have 100% containment. How do you use the LLM to essentially do information retrieval, but you're using rigid checks on what do I need to actually progress to the next stage of the conversation? What do I need in order to progress and hand this off to an agent? And then the same thing for that sort of like fully automated conversation. What do I need in order to complete this conversation? What's the good exit criteria? What's the LLM working towards? And then you're doing essentially like the rigid business logic checks to ensure that like the LLM is not like going all over the place and things like that. So that's kind of how I think about it. And it doesn't touch on like, there's hallucinations for sure in that like level 1. I think what you'd probably want to do is, I think things will get better over time. I think you could start to see some interesting paradigms like an NLU that determines the intent paired with an LLM that generates the response paired with an NLU that checks the response. Like you could start to see some interesting frameworks like that to try to get rid of hallucination. But I don't, it'll be impossible to get rid of the hallucinations 100% of the time. And just anytime you're using statistics, which is basically what these LLMs are, like you can never have 100% certainty, but it will get very, 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 very good. And you might be able to get rid of certainty for like anything that's too high risk, right? Like if it's like, I don't know, like a medical bot or something like that, anytime you determine it's a topic that's high risk, you might actually just choose to use purely deterministic flows if you cannot afford a 0.0001 chance.
Yeah, it's a case of how kind of critical the use case is, isn't it? Like the risks of the business of getting it wrong and stuff like that. If it's involving finances or health or something like that, and that kind of routing use case, we definitely put that under the interpreting. You're interpreting what someone's wanting, and you put them to the right place. Totally. Which is great. That makes perfect sense. What are your thoughts on the tooling around large language models? So you're building tooling that obviously incorporates large language models. There's a lot of kind of things around there that harness them. One of the areas that is a bit of a gap, at least from where I'm sort of sitting, is let's take the example there of someone's using a large language model, either in that routing case, maybe it's not the routing one, but maybe it's more sort of like more transactional fulfillment based journeys.
Yeah.
But it's a company like, we did a webinar, for example, with Cigna Express Scripts. They handle 4,500 concurrent conversations. So that's like right at this moment in time, right now as we're speaking, they might be managing 4,500 conversations.
Wow.
And so you mentioned there the statistical kind of spread, I suppose, of potential for hallucinations.
Yeah.
If I was a company like that and I want to deploy these models, even if it's an FAQ use case, if it's an FAQ that's related to someone's prescription and what can I use this drug for versus that drug or whatever, you don't really want to get that sort of stuff wrong. But there isn't necessarily, unless you're kind of either aware or building otherwise, kind of like quality assurance tools that can sort of like sit before something goes out to do that kind of monitoring. Because all I can see is I'm hearing people talk about things like, what is it? It's chain of thought prompting with, what is it called? I forget what it's called, but it's basically using large language models to vet the response of various large language models to see where the consistency is, taking the most consistent answer and then using that basically. Yeah. And so, but that seems to me as though you're marking your own, you're grading your own homework. You're using large language models to vet the response of the large language model, so that the limitations of the one technology are inherent in the other. So I don't know what your thoughts are in terms of that sort of like quality assurance at scale question for this kind of technology.
Yeah, I think sometimes as an industry, it kind of goes back to like focusing too much on the tooling uh, not thinking about like what's the right tool for the job. And just because large language models are kind of the thing right now, like I had a chat with a bank exec, and it was a pretty funny conversation because it was like, we want to use ChatGPT, and I'm like, got it. And it was like, but I don't want it to hallucinate because it's like this sensitive stuff. And I go, got it. And so it's like you almost want to like hand write the messages for ChatGPT, and it's like, yes, right. And then you sit there and you kind of laugh a little bit because are we using large language models in places where maybe that's actually not the right place? Like maybe for sensitive answers, you're just going to use an NLU with a deterministic response, and that is the correct approach to achieve that user experience that you're looking for, where if the correctness of the answer is the most important thing, then maybe that is the right approach. Like I think what's dangerous about we've all had friends in the past where maybe they say something and they're like, you don't know what you're talking about. It's far more dangerous if that friend sounds really confident and sounds really right. Like at least with the bots before, they would break and say, sorry, I don't know that. Now they kind of give you an answer that sounds pretty good. I would almost argue that's more dangerous in a lot of scenarios. And so yeah, I think it totally depends on the use case. Like we haven't seen this as much. Like it's tough to do a lot of this stuff in the enterprise. I think as an industry, we've sort of been pontificating on it for like 6 months, but I think what you probably end up seeing is something like an NLU to do the inference, just given that LLMs are really expensive, with an LLM to generate the response. And if it's a net new response, you use the LLM to generate it. And over time, I think you actually start to cache answers. You start to say, hey, this was an answer that's 100% correct. It was generated by an LLM. And so over time, like you start to see more and more of the actual responses given being sort of, if it's in that short head, if it's in the normal distribution where it's like the 80% of the most, the majority of the volume is like 20% of the questions, those 20% of the questions are like totally hard coded. Like you have like variants and stuff, but like, it's a pre-written response. And then it's only for the things where you've never seen it before, it's a sort of a net new response. You let the LLM take a crack at it. And I think you then try to apply QA. Yeah, these things are expensive right now. LLMs are not cheap to run in production at like crazy scale. So I think you probably only want to use it as like a last resort. But otherwise, you're going to use like an NLU paired with a deterministic response. So a lot of this is under customer support. There are use cases for agents where like, you can't do it. Like, I don't know, it's a good example. Maybe like, if you have like tons and tons and tons, like actually drive-throughs are a great example of this. Drive-throughs require so much variation in your ability to handle conversation that LLMs kind of enable the whole thing to actually be possible. Like I tried to build a drive-through assistant with NLU and deterministic answers 2 years ago, and it was crazy difficult because they're like, there's a whole myriad of reasons. That's something that's now totally unlocked with LLMs. But maybe like traditional customer support, which is like FAQs, refunds, like contacts, all that kind of stuff, that might actually still be better with traditional NLU and deterministic responses. So choose the right tool for the task is my TLDR.
Yeah, I think that seems fair as well, because like it seems to me at least as though the hype and the moment has kind of got everybody sort of swept up a little bit. Maybe it's just dying down a little bit now, but it was kind of like LLMs are the answers to everyone's prayers. Whereas really and pragmatically, you have to find out where LLMs are actually going to add value rather than create more work and or create more risk, And so I think that's where we'll see them used, I think, more broadly in enterprises, is in places that enhances an NLU for certain processes that require deterministic kind of models. And they don't necessarily have to be driving the conversation in order for them to be really useful and effective,
Yeah, I feel greatly we're on sort of the come down of the hype cycle. Like, we at Voiceflow, we were certainly caught right up in it. I remember saying to one of our board members, I believe the AGI was right around the corner. And then looking back at it now, it's like, well, how I defined AGI, was fairly vague, but we were like, there was a couple months in, I don't know, call this like late Q1, where it was like every week it was like GPT-4 came out. It can now do images, baby GPT, auto GPT, age. It was like if we just, I was just like extrapolating the curve out a couple more months, and I was like, holy, this is going to change quite a bit. And I think now, the way I view LLMs is as a much more tame approach, which is these are, conversational AI has always been the intermingling of the interface and the end user interface, which is like, conversation, all that kind of stuff, with the channel, and then business logic. And now I think the channel for the most part has stayed the same. People are still using like web chat interfaces, IVRs, like that hasn't been revolutionized, like the actual end channel. The interface that's used in that channel has become extremely fluid, and it can glide really easily, and it can like handle conversations, and that's awesome. And then the business logic for the most part has not changed. And the system integrations, like integrating with your CRM and integrating with your agent light handoff platform, all that kind of stuff, that hasn't changed. And so when I think about like the three sort of core things that could have dramatically changed, it's really right now just that sort of interface in the middle where you can have really fluid conversations. That's amazing. But ultimately, you still have to design out business logic, and you still have to have it deployed to a web chat or an IVR or an SMS or something like that.
Definitely. Chain of thought prompting with self-consistency was what I was looking for earlier on when I was talking about monitoring multiple models, seeing what's consistent, and then using that to be the answer. But then what you need to do there is you need to have like multiple models. And so doing that at scale, it's expensive enough to use one model, but you're using 4 models, and then you're going to grade the responses. It's going to get very expensive. But
quick funny story here. I like to build like Voiceflow agents on the weekends and stuff. Like it's one of my hobbies. And I was building this agent where I essentially wanted to like have like a every single time you would give it a new piece of information, it would like check in its transcript, and it would update the previous histories, and like sort of have this like constant recurring memory. And then as you came up against the context and token limit, it would then actually look at its memory and see where it could condense, like sort of remove some fidelity. And over time, you'd sort of have this like, massive long-term memory. And I built this, and I have the Voiceflow credit card, so it had, an unlimited number of tokens to play with. And then I shared the template with the community. And I forgot to disclaim that, hey, like this might burn 1 million tokens a call. And then I had a whole bunch of Voiceflow users like complaining to me. They're like, what the heck? Like you like burned up all of our tokens. I'm like, oh, crap. So yeah, it's all these like really intensive, cool stuff that you can do with LLMs. It's very token intensive. Like it's like, it might end up being like $1 a call to do like, some of this like chain of thought and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I did read about Microsoft potentially working on a chip which is intended to try and bring the cost of this kind of stuff down. How far away or close that is, who knows? But yeah, it's interesting.
I think the only like one technology thing, I think right now they're too expensive, but I think as technologists we should always assume that things will get exponentially cheaper over time. Like that's one assumption we're making at Voiceflow is like we used to be worried about the latency when we were building our initial LLM features. We thought that was going to come down. It has. And then we were worried about cost, and that came down by 1 order of magnitude. And we think it's going to come down for more. And so I think most people should be under that assumption too, that like at some point LLMs will become maybe not, but like they'll become comparable to like an NLU.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's the chips cost at the minute. I think that's half the battle, is that they require big computing power to run the inference and stuff like that. And as long as it costs a lot of money to do that, then that's kind of where it's going to come from. But I think the economies of scale, obviously, that'll come with that. And if there is new chips coming down the pipeline from Microsoft or whatever, then inevitably it's going to get a lot cheaper, a lot quicker. There was one final question I had. I know we're a little bit over, so apologies for running over. I had one last question, because I spoke to Mikhail Burstev last week, who is the founder of Deep Pavlov. And one of the things he mentioned is that they've been doing a lot of experimentation with large language models, and when they've benchmarked large language models to other NLP models, the classification wasn't as effective and entity extraction wasn't as effective. But I know of quite a number of vendors who've told me personally that classification is a absolute kind of like, dream use case for large language models. And so is entity extraction. So I'm kind of hearing two things from I mean, I don't doubt Mikhail. He's a very experienced, very sort of like, shrewd sort of researcher who's got lot of experience in this kind of field. But at the same time, people who I trust tell me otherwise. So I'm curious about what your kind of opinions are, specifically not the generation. We've discussed generation, we've discussed potential hallucinations, but specifically on the classification and entity extraction side of things.
Yeah. So I'm not as deep on the technical side, so I'll just give what I see. The Voiceflow NLU performs 1% better in classification tasks against standard benchmarks than GPT-4. GPT-4 was 3 orders of magnitude more expensive to run. Again, costs will come down over time. I think NLUs I think over time LLMs will become better for classification than NLUs, but at the present moment, I think NLUs are typically faster and cheaper by such a large degree that it makes more sense to use them. However, I think as you know, assuming sort of like NLUs reaching the top of its maturity curve, and I don't think it is, because I think LLMs are actually going to help NLUs a lot, but then I do think sort of the progress for LLMs is, we're just at the beginning of it for the most part. It will become better at classification over time, and I think what you might then see is using an LLM for classification, an LLM for generation, and then you might use a chain of thought to actually check on the actual response itself. Like you might use an LLM end to end with multiple different calls. I don't think I'm in a strong enough position to say it, but I know that right now, if you're going to go deploy a bot at scale, NLUs are far cheaper and generally is good at classification. And so it really comes down to cost and things like that.
Nice,
but that will change. That will change.
Oh yeah, 100%. I think it'll all change. I think what's really interesting is how, we're not necessarily right at the very beginning of this, but we're certainly at the beginning of the technology being utilized properly within tooling platforms like Voiceflow, and also definitely at the beginning of the kind of population's general awareness of this stuff.
Totally.
I told the anecdote before about my mum. My mum texts me, gets a text. Are you watching Question Time? I said, no, I'm not watching Question Time. Why? They're talking about this computer that's going to kill us all. I'm like, are you talking about ChatGPT? She said, well, you've heard of it. I was like, I fucking heard of it, ma'am. This is all I do every day. So it's like, if I know when something has reached maximum exposure, and that's when I get a text from my mom saying that this stuff's happening. So it's definitely early days as far as I think seeing how we can apply this, because now that people who weren't part of the Alexa movement, weren't part of the Facebook Messenger movement, weren't part of the initial kind of IVR automation sort of space, like now there's a brand new breed of people who are now finally waking up to conversational AI. They don't think of it as conversation design. They think of it as prompt engineering. They don't think of them building AI assistants. They think of building agents. But we're all talking about the exact same stuff. And so what's interesting is where it's going to head over the next kind of 5 years, now that we've seemed to have kind of, the community and the technology has finally reached itself out of the parrot pit, and it's out there in the world now,
Totally. It's been a marketer's nightmare, the amount of different terms that Voiceflow has to use. Like we're going in on the agents thing, but like assistants was sort of the past 2 years. Before that was skills. It's bots was before that. It's been as an industry, let's all vow to choose one and stick with it, because it makes it difficult to build up SEO and know what to even call ourselves too. So yeah, it's been exciting. I mean, I think the next 5 years, I feel super fortunate that we're in an industry that I feel super excited to work on every day. Like, it's been so cool seeing what the community is building and seeing everyone super jacked up. And also, we have like the folks who've been in the community for a while now, for 4 or 5 years. You and I have, it's my 3rd time on the podcast. It's cool to see like this fresh injection of excitement where it's the biggest wave that any of us have been a part of. And I think more than anything else, the wave has a lot of ground to stand on. It's, there's real business objectives, like business progress is being met by using these technologies. And I think that's the most exciting thing, since, I think in the past we've had, I think it's sort of about Alexa in particular. Alexa had a lot of momentum. I still think there's a really bright future for Alexa. And, I would be surprised if Amazon doesn't make big moves in the coming years. given all the LLM stuff. But the initial version of the developer ecosystem had a lot of excitement, and then didn't hit the business value. And it feels like large language models are now starting to hit that point where people are going to be able to build their careers off of it, and that's going to make the industry a lot bigger. So yeah, it's going to be exciting times, and we're happy to be a part of the community.
Nice one. And a very, very valued member of the community, definitely. I mean, Voiceflow has always been at the heart of the community, real dedication to not just trying to sell. And that's the thing that I think is missing with a lot of technology companies today, is that they're far too focused on selling and not enough focused on education, not enough focus on creating content that's teaching people the principles, the practices, the frameworks, the methodologies. And I think it's commendable that you and the team are so focused on that, because we know how hard it is to create consistent content over time that's a sufficient quality and stuff like that. It's a labor of love sometimes. And so I definitely like the style. And I think that the pivot into adopting large language models is 100% sensible. I think the proclamation, I suppose, for want of a better phrase, of coming out there and saying, okay, now we're going to be a platform. I think ultimately in long term, that is a very smart move, because you do have a real good community of designers. You've got a real solid pedigree in design. And at the moment, there isn't really a tool that can unify the design and development sort of worlds. And so I'm definitely excited to see where you take it. And good luck. We'll come on next year and do a fourth one.
Appreciate it. No, I was going to say we are a bunch of product people who love building communities, and we realized we had to build a business to support that. Versus, I think some folks might, they build a business and they realize that they have to do a community and a good product to make it work. And so, our at the end of the day, like, one of our values as a company is put customers first. Try to do everything that in service to the customer, and make sure that at the end of the day, we hope that if we build enough goodwill in the industry, that things sort of work out in the long run, and that's continued to be true for the past couple of years. So yeah, thanks everyone for tuning in. It's been I didn't even realize this was going to be live, so it's been awesome to see folks' comments and things.
Well, exactly. Well, thank you for joining me. Yeah, it's always nice to do a surprise live. It's been very active on the comments there. There's lots of people commenting, lots of good questions. Thank you all for tuning in. Adrian Thompson, shout out to Adrian. He said, I thought it was going to be another boring Monday. Then I came across you guys. Brilliant insight as per usual. Love Voiceflow. Definitely. Nice one. Thank you, Braden, so much. Thank you all for tuning in. And you can join me again if you want to this week. I'm also chatting this week with, who am I chatting with? We've got Matt Taylor from Noble. We're going to be talking about large language models again. And we've got Tim Freeble from Genesis. We're going to be talking about customer journey analytics. So we've got 3 podcasts this week, believe it or not, to talk about dedication. And me and Braden will see you all at the Voice and AI Summit if you are going to be there in Washington. And if you're not going to be there in Washington and you want to learn a little bit more about what we've been talking about, you can go to voiceflow.com, VOICEFLOW.com. Until next time.